And joining us now is Gerald Caplan, author of The Betrayal of Africa. And we welcome you back to TVO, Jerry.
Thank you,
It's good
Steve.
to see you again.
You too.
What are you trying to accomplish with this book?
I've been, my life has been interwoven with Africa for well over 40 years. And I've seen quite amazing things happen. Most of them not very happy, most of them not welcome, most of them completely contradictory to what we 40 years ago hoped and expected and dreamed of from a new Africa. And it was just time for me to pull all the strings together. I'm terribly, terribly concerned, and have been for a long time, that the awful, unending stories of violence and conflict, look at this year, from Kenya to Zimbabwe to South Africa now with the xenophobic violence, makes Westerners, I mean all of us in the white, rich West, wonder what's really going on and whether Africans are really up to it. And I fear a kind of implicit racism that people wouldn't say ever that way, but makes them wonder whether Africans are really equipped to govern themselves.
I want to pursue more of that in a second, but
Sure.
I still want to follow up on this, your personal connection to Africa, because it goes back 40 years. Do you remember what sparked it for you?
No, I don't. I did my doctorate in African history, and I don't know what the step before that was. I don't know how I made that decision, but I did. I wanted to do it. I got a Commonwealth scholarship. It was based in old white Rhodesia. I got deeply involved in old white Rhodesian politics. Rhodesia became Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe. I got deeply involved in nationalist politics, in anti-white politics, in early liberation politics, ended up going to jail, jailed by the white government there, thrown out of the country, and it became part of my soul ever since.
How many times have you visited the continent since then?
Oh, I can't count. I go, I think for the last 10 years, when I've re-immersed myself thanks to a study of the Rwandan genocide, I've gone an average of 2 or 3 times a year, I guess. And I like being back, even though I often don't like what I see when I'm back, and I can't resolve that contradiction.
Let's follow up on how much we know about this continent. Strangely enough, Africa's in the news a lot, and not only for terrible reasons, you know, sometimes because celebrities are involved in bringing our attention to various things that are going on there. George Clooney made a fantastic documentary about Darfur. You no doubt saw Bono's edited edition of Vanity Fair, which was a huge seller. Journalist Stephanie Nolan is writing fantastic stuff out of the whole continent, particularly in Zimbabwe. And yet you tell us that we know precious little about what goes on there. Why is that?
We know what's in the daily headlines. We know that terrible things are happening. We know that Africans are doing awful things to each other. And I don't ever want to escape that reality, but we don't know why it happens. We don't know who organizes it. We don't quite know what the role of African governments are, and we know nothing, this is of course one of my major hypotheses, we know nothing about the central role of the outside world, especially we in the West, in influencing African life for 500 years. And I think that's a terrible problem. What it means is, what we see when we see black South Africans attacking black Mozambicans or black Zimbabweans, it's just, or any of the photographs out of Kenya early in the year of violent-looking thugs beating the hell out of women or children. It looked like pictures from Rwanda 14 years ago. We just see that happening, and we have no context, and we have no perspective, and we have no idea of how those events came to be played out. And I wrote a book because I think it takes 2 to tango. What I mean is that it takes not only Africans to be involved in this mess, but it's taken the West to help create the groundwork and enabled the messes that we read about.
You've hung out with enough politicians in your day. Does the political class of this country or of the United States get what needs to be done over there?
No, I don't think they have the foggiest idea. The Canadian political class, the Canadian government at the moment, I want to say this in a completely nonpartisan way, seems totally indifferent to all things African. The American government is full of self-congratulation, the Bush administration, because of the money it gives through something with this funny acronym PEPFAR for AIDS in Africa. It's given over the last 5 years $30 billion. That's the most generous that any government has ever been to Africa. But in context of the Bush administration, it's small change. $30 billion is about 3 months of the Iraq War, you know? At the same time, what they're doing against Africa by the subsidies they give the rich American agribusiness that kills African farmers, by the way they help they help facilitate corruption among Africans in a dozen different ways that I try to systematically lay out in the book. You need the Americans, the Brits, the French, us to the limited extent to be involved, are hurting Africa more than they're helping it. So while we, good Canadians all, progressive, decent, want to give foreign aid, are thrilled when a young boy in Eastern Ontario helps build a well in Uganda, well, our hearts go out to Africa. In fact, the West is exploiting Africa far more than it's helping it to develop.
Well, since you mentioned Bush, Michael, let's skip the board for a second. Let's do the Bush clip first. The president said this about his administration's efforts over there. Roll tape.
We've also revolutionized the way we approach development. Too many nations continue to follow either the paternalistic notion that treats African countries as charity cases, or a model of exploitation that seeks only to buy up their resources. America rejects both approaches. Instead, we're treating African leaders as equal partners, asking them to set clear goals and expecting them to produce measurable results. For their part, more African leaders are willing to be held to high standards. And together, we're pioneering a new era in development. The new era is rooted in a powerful truth. Africa's most valuable resource is not its oil, it's not its diamonds, it is the talent and creativity of its people. So we're partnering with African leaders to empower their people, to lift up their nations, and write a new chapter in their history.
The president from a few months ago. You want to pick issue with any of that?
No, just with all of it. His press secretary has just written a book we've all read about in the last couple of days, that the president both deceives himself and lies about everything, and I think that's a perfect example of both of them. I think he may well believe what he just said, but it is the purest kind of Orwellian proposition. We treat Africans only as charity while we exploit them. And we talk about their leaders as being equals and partners rather than subordinates, and it's a kind of ritual, Steve. Here's what happens, that 3 or 4 times a year, Western leaders get together. It'd be at the United Nations, it would be at the G8, it would be at some summit or other, and in would come some of the key African leaders, Mbeki, a couple of years ago, Obasanjo, people like that, and they'd all put up their hands and they'd pledge to do better next year. The Africans would pledge to reform and democratize their systems, and the West would pledge to stop exploiting, stop giving farm subsidies, to finally give the amount of aid they said they would. In a dozen ways that we screw Africa, time after time, we would stop, and then they both go home and they fail to do either, both the Africans and the Western leaders. And that's what I call the conspiracy. It's a conspiracy because both sides always fail to tell the truth. They always fail to say what's really going on. And you know, I don't even understand it. I don't understand. Your audience will remember, as you will, Glen Eagles was only 3 years ago. It was the talk of the town. It was Bono. It was hundreds of thousands of people at concerts and demonstrations, and the leaders of the G8 swore, and they brought in the leading African presidents to watch it in Glen Eagles, Scotland, and they swore that we will make sure that every single person with AIDS gets antiviral treatment. We will make sure that our aid budget goes up dramatically. We will make sure that debt is no longer collected in a way that costs you more than you can possibly afford. We'll stop subsidizing our rich farmers so that your farmers aren't overwhelmed. And then they went back and they did absolutely none of it. For the 3 years since Glen Eagles, development aid through the G8 has fallen in all but one country, and that includes Canada. And so while George Bush says that it's not charity anymore, that it's equal, in fact, in a dozen ways, including American control of the World Bank and the IMF, impose conditions on African governments that continue to create inequality without creating growth, that continue to force African governments to accept a form of development that has failed in all of human history ever to work in developmental
Okay,
terms.
given this then, and given the colonial past and the 500 years you referred to, how does the West do anything there that isn't automatically regarded as, you know, having ulterior motives or with suspicion?
It's not regarded that way. You remember when Bush a few months ago did his little hop through Africa, stopping at 4 or 5 countries, I guess.
He did a little hop. He did more than the dancing was something else.
Listen, everybody goes to African dance. They got natural rhythm, right? Everybody loves to be black. What can I tell you? It's a bizarre thing. He was welcomed in every single country as a conquering hero. There wasn't a single president who said to him, excuse me, the way your country and the way the financial institutions that your country controls are causing us harm, the way they're setting back our economies is causing us great problems. Not that. They danced, they cheered.
Well, why don't they say that?
I think they're afraid that they will pay serious consequences. And they will pay serious consequences. They will be cut off from foreign aid. Their debt will not be forgiven. There will not be an end to the subsidies that cause their farmers such grief. Let me give you an example. If you are in Ghana and want to have a chicken dinner, it is cheaper for you to buy a chicken that came from Europe than a chicken that was grown by a farmer 1 mile away from you, because of the subsidies that the European Union gives to its farmers. You can use that example with cotton in the United States. You can use it with sugar. You can use it with textiles in almost every aspect. So we insist that in the name of free trade, that Africans have to drop all forms of protectionism, but we don't drop any forms of our protectionism. So it's this one-way street that we tell them what to do, they do it, and it's always in our interest for them to follow. Just did I make that clear? It always acts in our interest for them to take our advice, never in their interest. And this is true on issue after issue after issue.
What do you think of the role China's playing in Africa right now?
Oh, it's fascinating, but it's too early to know. We've got, the West has 500 years on China in learning how to exploit Africa and take advantage.
But they're learning quickly, aren't they?
Well, they're all over the place. Their political neutrality, their explicit proposition that they're not there to impose conditions on Africa the way the West imposes conditions on our loans and our grants and our aid, has led them to terrible anomalies like supporting the genocidal government of Sudan, supporting Mr. Mugabe, supporting the government of Angola. This is all just awful. And will they learn? I have no idea. The positive is that they are creating a possibility that African governments, you asked why nobody speaks up against George Bush. They are creating the possibility that there is a new paradigm for development, that African governments don't have to look to the IMF and the World Bank and to aid from the United States and Britain and France. The possibility that in the competition, which is severe between China and the West, especially the United States, for the resources of Africa, especially the oil and the other natural resources, that maybe African governments will find some space where they can play the two off against each other, and maybe they can have a little more independence in creating their own development schemes.
Apropos of this sort of bargain with the devil that both sides appear to have made, I'm going to ask our director, Michael Smith, to bring up the cover of your book for a second, because there are two.
Good.
This picture says 1,000 things, right? You've got Mobutu Sese Seko on the left. There he is, who is the former dictator from Zaire, and the prince from Netherlands on the right, whose name I forget now. Hang on, I'll look.
Prince Bernhard.
Prince Bernhard. And look at the smile on his face, and look at Mobutu wagging his finger in his face. That says a mile, doesn't it?
Yeah, it was. I should say it's the Groundwood people who came up with that wonderful picture. I want to give them credit. Can I use this story?
Go ahead.
Mobutu and the Congo, which is related next door to the Rwanda, are the perfect examples of the conspiracy that I talk about between the West and the Western leaders and African leaders. Mobutu was put in power by the American government after the Belgians with the Americans behind the scenes and using a few Africans after they murdered a man named Patrice Lumumba, who was the first elected president of the Congo, the only elected president of the Congo.
1961, I think.
Good for you, 1960-61. They assassinated him within a year of him president, and they put Mobutu in. Mobutu immediately became one of the world's greatest kleptomaniacs. He stole the country blind. He had castles all over the world. He had his own jet airport in an obscure part of the country where he was born. He owned properties in Monaco, and he owned properties in Switzerland. In all that time, he received billions of dollars from the World Bank, acting on behalf of the Western interests, in order to keep him in the so-called anti-communist camp. But always, Steve, they knew that not a penny of the money they were giving him would ever go to anybody in the country except him and his cronies. Always they did that. So there was this perfect deal. He was getting all this money pretending to be an anti-communist. What did he care?
Cold War's over. So what's the excuse today?
Oh, well, it wasn't over so fast. Rwanda was after the Cold War, you remember. So in Rwanda, you have a country where we think Africans just crazily killed each other. In fact, the entire ethnic division of Rwanda would never have happened if Catholic missionaries hadn't created a sense of division between these two peoples, the Tutsi and the Hutu, that had never existed before, if the Belgian colonial government had never institutionalized those divisions, and then once a demented, greedy, extremist elite of Hutu leaders decided that in order to protect their turf, they had to kill all the Tutsis, the French government and the French army hadn't come in to help them do it. So that's, Mobutu was a good friend of the president of Rwanda, the one who was murdered, and he protected him too. So there, the American protected Mobutu is protecting the French protected Habyarimana. So again, all I want people to understand is that it's not just Africans acting by themselves in these bizarre and savage ways. Wherever there is trouble, you will find somewhere that the West is in the middle of it, either by omission or by commission, enabling it.
Is it unfair to say, though, that this continent seems to have a remarkable ability to come up with some of the worst bastards in history? Is that unfair to say?
There's a chapter in the book in which I describe some of these bastards, and I describe some of the things they did, some of the things they deliberately and publicly did. This was not quietly going out and murdering people. Idi Amin and Bokassa, who made himself an emperor, and I think I don't remember anymore, but I think if you wanted to humiliate an entire continent, nothing could have helped more than the antics of these murderers and psychopaths and killers. Nobody knows how many people they killed. It's in the millions. Nobody knows how much money they stole. It's in the billions. But again, not one of them, Steve, could have operated if they didn't have either the French government or the American government, by and large, behind them. Mobutu for the French, this fellow Bokassa, who was some of our audience might remember, who was a laughing stock for years when he was about this tall, and he made himself an emperor. And he spent an entire year of French aid on the coronation. But you know what? The French government came to that coronation at the highest levels. The president at the time, the French president at the time, used to go hunting with Bokassa because he had a special reserve back in the interior. So these guys just didn't operate alone. They were part of this conspiracy of elites, all of whom acted, whatever else they did, they made sure that Africans never benefited from their work.
A couple of minutes left. I want to touch on two more things. Africa is still a real magnet in this world for young, idealistic people who want to go and make a difference. So what advice would you give them?
First of all, they should understand that they're not going to save Africa. I'm really, really afraid of this notion that Africans are the problems and we're the solutions, that we're the saviors. Of the many books that have been written trying to explain Africa in the last few years, the best title is Bill Easterly's White Man's Burden. This notion that we're going to go over there and build them the toilets and the pumps and the schools that they can't do without us. That's wrong. They have to go over and know that we have I mean, most of the audience would never believe what I'm now going to say, that we have taken far more resources out of Africa than we've put in, we in the West, through all the aid we give and through all the other forms of apparent help. So I hope Canadians, young Canadians, go over. I know lots of them ask me what to do. And the first thing I tell them is, don't go to think that you're helping this poor, savage group of people who can't do anything unless we white Canadians or any whites come and help you. So when kids talk about giving back, I try to tell them that's literally what it means. We owe restitution. We owe compensation for the lives we've taken. The slave trade is not that long ago. Apartheid is not that long ago. Apartheid functioned with the active support of Western corporations and American government and the British government. So all that is not gone. It's still part of the history. It's still the reason that we're having today's riots in South Africa. So go knowing that you're paying back a debt, that you're doing it in terms of social justice, not in terms of you being a great humanitarian or compassionate person.
And finally, what keeps you going back?
Oh, I don't know, just bad taste. It's in my blood. I won't talk like some people do about loving Africa. I don't know whether I love Africa, but it's more than half of my life, and I have dear friends, and I've lived in 3 countries, and I've been in half of the other countries, and I just can't believe it can't get better. I know these wonderful people. There's civil society organizations all across Africa, most remarkable young men and women that you've ever met, tough, determined, not afraid to stand up, even though you can get beat up if you stand up. And I just want to see these people succeed, and one day I pray they will.
Last 30 seconds. It's a hard question to ask because it forces you to kind of look hard at your own life, but given how much of your life you have spent trying to make this continent better, you think it was time well spent?
Sure.
Despite what you see and read and hear
Sure.
and everything?
My job in life has always been to fight for certain ideals. You and I have talked about this in other passages. I've been politically involved in Canada. The fight for social justice and equality and is what's driven me all my life, and Africa's a great place to fight it. Do you win? Hell, I haven't won anything in my life.
Well, you won a spot on this show.
Well, and that's
better
worth,
than a kick in the head, I guess.
anything.
It's better than a kick in the head. The Betrayal of Africa is the book. It is a great primer on what is going on this continent. Gerald Caplan has been our guest. Thanks so much.
Steve, thanks.